So that I think that the internet is going to be one of the major forces for reducing the role of government. The one thing that's missing, but that will soon be developed, is a reliable e-cash, a method whereby on the internet you can transfer funds from A to B without A knowing B or B knowing A. The way in which I can take a $20 bill and hand it over to you, and there's no record of where it came from. And you may get that without knowing who I am. That kind of thing will develop on the internet, and that will make it even easier.
Greetings, everybody. The clip you just saw is often cited as Milton Friedman predicting the invention of Bitcoin. If you listen to what he was actually saying, he's talking about something much closer to Monero, which is a privacy token that is much more effective for criminals to use and much harder to trace. Bitcoin, as we all know, has a public ledger that anyone can access, and it's far easier for law enforcement to track Bitcoin than it would be to track actual cash. Not quite the connection that people think it is sometimes. However, I did want to bring your attention to Milton Friedman's K% rule, where he thought of this as a replacement for the Federal Reserve, where the money supply would be almost completely fixed with a very tiny amount of inflation built in, where your GDP growth would always outgrow the money supply, creating a very stable economy, very low inflation. And what really does make you think about Bitcoin is his vision for this was that this would be run by computer software, a computer software that would be turned on, you couldn't shut it off, and it couldn't be tampered with. And that was his vision for the K% rule. And when you talk about that, it makes you wonder if this idea isn't what inspired Bitcoin, because now you have something very much like for like. In Satoshi Nakamoto's white paper, where he laid out his ideas for Bitcoin, it's very similar to this. So if you guys want to dig a little deeper, check out the K% rule and Milton Friedman's plan and how he wanted that to be locked in with software that was tamper-proof. I'm going to go ahead and play that whole interview for you. It's pretty interesting because he talks about technology companies and monopolies, and it's very telling about how our government thinks and how it likes to screw up a good thing. So go ahead, enjoy the full segment. There's a lot of good information to mine from it.
The National Taxpayers Union, America's largest taxpayer organization, has long been concerned about government being too big and reaching into areas of our lives where it shouldn't be. With this as a context, we've recently talked to Milton Friedman, Nobel laureate, at his home in San Francisco about antitrust regulation and current economic trends in the United States. First, we asked Dr. Friedman to provide some background on antitrust in the United States.
And the issue of antitrust is of long standing. The basic antitrust legislation was enacted in 1890, and we've had many ups and downs in its applications. When I first really got involved in considering the situation of antitrust, say about 50-odd years ago, I, like most economists, tended to be strongly in favor of the antitrust laws. We believe in competition. We believe that the best way in which a society can use its resources is to have individuals have the opportunity to compete one against the other. And the objective of the antitrust law is an excellent objective. The objective is to promote competition. But in the 50 years since then, there has been an enormous increase in the number of academic studies about the actual operation of the antitrust laws. It will come as no surprise to anybody who listens to this that the intention of a law and the result of a law are often very, very different. I believe that research has demonstrated that that is the case in respect of antitrust. The law is supposed to promote competition, but on the whole, it probably does more to promote monopoly than it does competition. Moreover, it involves a very inefficient interference by the government into the dynamics of the economy. We have case after case of that kind. The most extreme, of course, was the IBM case. Here was IBM. It was obviously a monopoly. It had control of the whole computing industry. And the government spent a case which dragged on for something like, what was it, 10, 12 years?
11 years, I believe, yeah.
About that, something like that, ultimately came to naught. In the meantime, what happened? IBM is far from a monopoly. Now the government says it's Microsoft that's the monopoly. But you know, technical change proceeds much faster than legal proceedings. As a result, I suspect that before this case is over, the character of the computer industry will be very different. George Stigler, my long-term colleague and friend, did the most over this period to investigate the actual operation of the antitrust laws. And he, like I, or I because of him, shifted from being a strong defender of antitrust in the 1950s to being a firm opponent of antitrust, believing that it was a law that did more harm than good by the time he finished his studies. Monopoly is a real problem, but it tends to be transitory, to be very short-lived in most cases. The only ways in which monopoly can last is when it has government backing. We have a very interesting case coming right now. Here's the steel industry. It's not a monopoly. There are lots of companies in the steel industry, but there's a law just passed that would limit steel imports. That will, in effect, make the American industry a monopoly in terms of the world competition.
Dr. Friedman talked to us about the natural response of business to government regulation. Often, in his view, a business's short-term view trumps its long-term best interest and that of the economy as a whole.
Business in general has something of a suicidal instinct. It often proposes laws in its own self-interest which destroy the underlying basis of the whole private enterprise system. I believe that is what has been happening recently in the computer industry. Silicon Valley is suicidal in calling government in to mediate in its disputes among some of the big companies in the area and Microsoft. The end result will be that an industry that up to now has been able to proceed at a marvelous pace with little or no government regulation. It has been a wonderful example of the efficiencies of a strictly free private market. That industry is now going to have government all over it. It's going to spend in legal fees over the next 10 or 20 years, money which society would benefit from much more if it were spent in the kind of research and development that has brought us the many miracles in the area of internet, in the area of home computers, industry computers, and all the rest. In short, society operates best when government keeps to its fundamental purposes of maintaining law and order and defending the country. When it starts getting involved in whether Microsoft should make one kind of a contract or another kind of a contract, it's out of its depth. It operates slowly and not very effectively. For that reason, I believe we would be better off indeed if we simply repealed the antitrust laws and let the companies compete one with the other.
Many have marveled at the rapid growth of America's high-tech sector. Indeed, many see the expansion in high-tech and the service sector generally as the cause for economic prosperity in the 1990s. We asked Dr. Friedman if the lack of regulation from Washington, at least during the first 2 decades of the personal computer revolution, is a central cause of the prosperity of the high-tech sector.
Silicon Valley has been very fortunate precisely for that reason. Up until a few years ago, it wasn't even involved in making big contributions to Washington. It neither had to spend money to buy the legislators, nor did it have to spend money conforming to detailed regulations. And as a result, it was able to devote all of its efforts and energies to improving its product. Now, the situation is changing. I think the same thing has happened in other areas. The initial antitrust laws were enacted supposedly because the railroads were a monopoly, were monopolies and were Now, railroads, nobody today would say they would be a monopoly. Trucking has come along. Airlines have come along. In each of these cases, it's an illustration of the ubiquity of competition if the government keeps its hands off. It's very hard to name a private monopoly which has been able to maintain itself in the absence of government, of a government-granted monopoly. One case in antitrust which you might regard as a success was the breakup of the telephone company. But AT&T was a government-provided monopoly. And as a result, it did have monopolistic effect. Its breakup did have good results in opening the door to further competition.
Many have expressed concern that if Microsoft is forced to give up its Windows program code or some other draconian measure, the economic impact on Silicon Valley would be devastating. The potential implications could be quite serious, as entrepreneurs second-guess every advance they make and wonder whether this will cause a pack of government lawyers to descend upon them. But Dr. Friedman is somewhat more optimistic than this. There are costs, but in his view, the ingenuities of the private sector will limit the damage that government can do.
Don't underestimate the ingenuity of private enterprise to get around government regulation. I think that the main harm which will be done will be the waste of resources that could otherwise be used productively. But you won't prevent competition. You won't prevent further advance. You'll slow it down. Once you get government involved, though, it's almost difficult to get it out. That's the other part of it. Steel is another good example. Alexander Hamilton, in his original report on manufacturers to Congress, praised Adam Smith for his talk about free markets and free trade, but went on to say, of course, it doesn't apply to the United States. This is a different case. We have to protect our infant industries, he said. This is over 200 years ago. One of those infant industries was steel. It never grew up. It's still asking for protection right now. It's a dramatic example of why you better not get started along this line, because once you do, you get enmeshed. That's the great mistake that Silicon Valley has made, because they called government in on themselves.
So the costs will be both the immediate costs of this case and then the longer costs of continually having to focus and deal with these government regulators and figure out how to get around them and do their business.
You shouldn't have to waste ingenuity in getting around government regulations. That ingenuity should go to improving products.
Finally, we talked about the pursuit of Microsoft and other businesses by the judicial branch in a larger context, that of the freedom of individuals and entrepreneurs. At the close of the 20th century, there are many critical battles facing America. Entrepreneurs versus courts, children versus bureaucracies and teacher unions, taxpayers facing 40% plus tax burdens. Given that all these vital and quite difficult battles revolve around freedom, we asked Dr. Friedman whether he was optimistic or pessimistic as we enter a new millennium.
You're asking a very complicated question. I think there are two reasons to be optimistic. One is that ideas have changed. The rhetoric 50 years ago was very different from the rhetoric now. 50 years ago, the rhetoric was that everybody was a socialist. All intellectuals were socialists. They all believed that government was the answer to every problem. Today, nobody believes in socialism if you listen to them. That's the rhetoric. The reality is that we are much less free now than we were 50 years ago. Government is bigger, takes a larger fraction of our income, it imposes more controls on us. We are freer in some dimensions. There's been great social progress in tolerance of minorities. Our racial problem has been much improved, not through government, but through private activity. Nonetheless, that rhetoric is having its effect. There has been a reduction in government price and wage regulation, the kind of thing, the deregulation of airlines, the deregulation of communication. But what we have tended to do is to replace that by social regulation, aid to disability, the OSHA, OEC, that kind of environmental thing, that kind of thing. So the question is, will the rhetoric will the change in intellectual ideas carry through and produce a change in actual policy? I think there is a tendency for that. That's one source of optimism. But I think a much more reliable source of optimism is the growth of the Internet. In your area, the major effect of the Internet will be to make it harder for government to collect taxes. Governments can collect taxes best on things that don't move. Land is an ideal basis of taxation because you can't take it away. Yep. Individual states cannot go as far in taxing personal income as the federal government can, because people can move from one state to the other more easily than they move across countries. The Internet is going to make it very difficult to collect taxes on services of all kinds. After all, you can complete these transactions in cyberspace, not on the ground. You can, computer companies now are getting their programming done in India. I doubt that anybody's paying any taxes on any of that. Yeah. So that I think that the Internet is going to be one of the major forces for reducing the role of government. The one thing that's missing, but that will soon be developed, is a reliable e-cash, a method whereby on the Internet you can transfer funds from A to B without A knowing B or B knowing A. The way in which I can take a $20 bill and hand it over to you, and there's no record of where it came from. And you may get that without knowing who I am. That kind of thing will develop on the Internet, and that will make it even easier for people to use the Internet. Of course, it has its negative side. It means that the gangsters, the people who are engaged in illegal transactions will also have an easier way to carry on their business. But I think that the tendency to make it harder to collect taxes will be a very important positive effect of the Internet.